Oh, hi! I was just rereading some James Joyce. Yes, reading. Welcome to ELLROY Reads, and the book we are looking at this week's episode is Red Harvest by Dashiell Hammett. This is a collection of Dashiell Hammett's four greatest novels, but we're going to be looking specifically at Red Harvest. So ELLROY Reads, if you're new to the show, is the show where every week I look at a novel that was influential to James Ellroy, both that it inspired him and it influenced him stylistically, politically, emotionally, however it influenced him. Now, Red Harvest by Dashiell Hammett is one of the most important novels to James Ellroy in his development as a stylist. And the influence is unique for a number of ways because Hammett differs from many of other Ellroy's influences, and he differs really as a person from the type of people that Ellroy tends to like, at least socially, but also professionally, in that Ellroy, well, can be quite judgmental or holds the people who work around him and who he admires to the highest standard, and Hammett often doesn't kind of fall within that bracket, and that makes it all the more fascinating for us because if the influence is unique to Ellroy, then I want to talk about it on this show. Okay, so Red Harvest, plot-wise, is kind of hard to describe because it's kind of chaotic novel. It's set in this fictional copper mining town in Montana. It's called Personville, and from the opening line, we find out that the town has been nicknamed Poisonville because it is so corrupt and is so dark and sordid a place where it appears that there's no redemption, there's no real hope in the human spirit to rise above corruption and sin, if you like, or whatever low morals, whatever word you choose. So the Continental Op, the unnamed detective who was Hammett's most famous creation, is called out to Personville in Montana, and his first assignment is to interview this newspaper proprietor. But he arrives at the appointed place to interview him. The man is not there. He finds out that the man has been murdered. So he talks to the man's father, Eli Wilson, who basically runs the town. He's the local oligarch, and he says that the town has kind of slipped out of his hands into all of these competing gangs. There's numerous kind of small mafias, organized crime groups are running the place, and indeed the police themselves. They're not just corrupt, but they're out and out bootleggers and gangsters themselves. So the whole town is kind of mired in corruption. Now, what follows next? Some of the incidents kind of come across as incoherent, although we know from the beginning of the book, the opening premise, right through to the conclusion of the book, we broadly know what's happened and why we've got there, but there are so many incidents jam-packed into this narrative, which is only under 200 pages long. It was serialized in 4 parts in Black Mask magazine, and it was actually dedicated to the Black Mask's editor, Cap Shaw. That reading it in chunks really helps to take in and kind of slow down some of the action because people are always being shot, blown up, knifed, off and off page, off and on page. It's very hard to keep up. So the war that breaks out is in some ways precipitated by the Continental Op. He is nameless, and although he's got a certain hard-boiled charm, he's very much, occasionally he can tilt events his way, usually for venal advantage, and occasionally he's passive to events. And there's so much going on in that the individual is really powerless in this world. This is not Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. It's not the individual can make a difference against overwhelming odds. No celebration of the human spirit here. Okay, so a little bit of historical context. Dashiell Hammett worked as an operative for the Pinkerton Detective Agency between 1915 and 1922. Now, there's a lot of myths about Hammett that have developed over the past century. Uh, it's sometimes hard to separate myth from fiction, but one of them is that he was sent to Montana and he witnessed the Anaconda copper mining dispute and also the Anaconda Road massacre. You, another one that's been questioned. There's biographers who doubt he ever went to Montana, Butte, Montana. Another one is that he was offered a murder contract, $5,000 to murder the labor union organizer or agitator, Frank Little. That's also been questioned. But Hammett wasn't going to let the truth get in the way of a good story, and he soaked up enough atmosphere. He had a real reporter's eye for the drudgery of detective work, the ins and outs of it, to create a really gripping story and to sew it around a lot of violence. He was a Marxist, but by any measure, he was also a patriot because he served in World War I and II. He was an ambulance driver in World War I. There's a story that he liked to tell that at one point he's driving an ambulance away from the battlefield and it capsized and all the wounded tumbled out. But that's been questioned. There's no military record of that. And in World War II, at the age of 48, he managed to enlist in the US Army. He said he had a hell of a time getting in at that advanced stage, but he worked as a cryptanalyst in the Aleutian Islands, and he ended up writing the official military history of the Battle of the Aleutian Islands. But his Marxism really destroyed him because he went from being Hollywood's both most celebrated literary crime writer, Red Harvest and his other novels, which was first serialized in Black Mask, but then picked up for publication by Alfred A. Knopf. And that really started Knopf's legacy and tradition of publishing crime stories, which continues today with James Ellroy. And I know Ellroy is very proud to walk in the footsteps of Dashiell Hammett. But because he refused to testify in a number of the witch hunts and criminal trials against Communist Party members in the late 40s and early 50s, he ended up serving time in a West Virginia penitentiary, and all of his income had dried up. You know, he only wrote 5 novels. It's a relatively short output, although this is 4 of them. As you can tell by this, it's quite a sizable book. So I think the idea that his output was always minimal is somewhat overstated. But he'd created, from his novel The Thin Man, he'd created one of the all-time great and early Hollywood franchises of Nick and Nora Charles, the married detective couple. They were made into films, radio shows, television shows, a Broadway play. And he'd created the Continental Arp. He had a real eye for creating series, comic book series. But by the 50s, all of that had dried up, and he had developed emphysema. He was living with his common-law wife, Lillian Hellman, who was an amazing writer, a great playwright, and an amazing writer altogether. And he just didn't have the physical and emotional stamina needed to write books anymore. And he died at the age of 66 of lung cancer relatively penniless. So it's a sad end. And for Ellroy, when he began reading crime fiction, he read a lot of Hammett and Chandler, and really gravitated to Chandler first. He thought that Chandler's style was very, very easy. It was easy to imitate. It was just very, very easy to put into an entertaining narrative. And then he had this big revulsion against Chandler and really started to veer towards Hammett. Now, the way he pictures it is like being a Rolling Stones or a Beatles fan. He's almost like saying, like, it has to be one or the other. There's a comment he's repeated many times, which is Chandler wrote the man he wanted to be. Hammett wrote the man he was afraid he was. And I actually think some of Ellroy's ideas about, like, the genesis of American hard-boiled fiction are a simplification. I think they work for Ellroy as a self-publicist because he can say, you know, I'm walking in the footsteps of Hammett. Most other crime writers today are writing PI novels. They're really just Chandler rip-offs. So it's very good for him to give himself a kind of unique reputation. But in critical terms, I think, you know, it doesn't make that much sense because first of all, it forces out many of the other, you know, fathers of the hardboiled tradition and people who've taken hardboiled crime fiction and noir into totally different places. Plus, Chandler admired Hammett greatly. You know, his famous essay, The Simple Art of Murder, Hammett gave murder back to the people who actually committed it. So Chandler saw Hammett as reacting against the golden age of detective fiction. He didn't see him as reacting against him in any way. And in many ways, Chandler could be seen as a successor to Hammett, that he was following in his footsteps and developing his style and taking it into his own places. But Red Harvest is really this kind of anarchic novel because order has, in Poisonville, order has completely broken down. And we go through a series of kind of surreal and brutally violent events until order is restored, but at great cost of corruption. And we know it's only going to be a matter of time before it's going to slip into anarchy again. And the novel that Elroy has written, which is closest to this, would be White Jazz. Now, many people forget, because a lot has been written about the LA Quartet, and White Jazz was really at the tail end of Elroy's kind of noir period before he went into the big political novels, political historical fiction of the Underworld USA trilogy. But many people forget just how surreal White Jazz is. In Los Angeles, there was a complete breakdown of law and order. The events, the violence spirals completely out of control, and it's fast, one murder after another. And it's very hard to take in a kind of logically coherent sense. And then at the end, order is restored, but because the authorities are very worried about the public finding out how close everything came to breaking down, that this kind of media manipulation to kind of manipulate the facts as to what has actually happened and to suggest that the LAPD was in charge the whole time. And this is very much inspired by Red Harvest. And also, I mean, there's some scenes in particular in Red Harvest. There's a scene where the Continental Op drinks laudanum, and he goes into a drug-induced haze, and he's with a woman at the time, Dina Brown, who's kind of like the femme fatale of the piece. And I'm not giving a spoiler here. When he wakes up, she's dead. She's got an ice pick in her back. And it's a very surreal and disturbing scene. And there's a similar scene in White Jazz where Dave Klein is drugged, and then in a drug-induced haze, he's filmed murdering someone with a samurai sword, or I think it's actually a U.S. Marine sword, but it's from the Pacific campaign. And then he's shown this film afterwards to blackmail him into kind of similar situations that the Continental Op was in. So Elroy really admired Hammett greatly. Like I say, Elroy can be a little bit judgmental about other writers. Like for writers like, say, Bukowski, he's not impressed with writers who indulge in a kind of rock and roll lifestyle, i.e., they drink, they take drugs, and that somehow inspires some creative spark in them. And he doesn't buy this idea that, or that, the pressures of being an artist will inevitably push you towards addiction or anything like that. It can be a little bit kind of parsimonious about these things. So with Hammett, it's kind of different. Hammett was an alcoholic, although he quit alcohol in 1948. His health was in steep decline, so it was a matter of buying himself more time. And his smoking really killed him, and he went into a long period, the last years of his life, of inactivity. Now that was partly bad luck and it's partly persecution, but that's really the opposite of Elroy, because he will keep writing until he drops. And he always thought it was very sad that Hammett was cut out early, and there aren't many writers where Elroy has actually written about the tremendous influence on him. I mean, he will talk a lot. He's loquacious. He's a great raconteur. He will talk about writers and their lives. He will offer sometimes funny, controversial judgments. But he wrote about Hammett in a marvellous piece for the Guardian newspaper here in the UK, and it's called Hammett, the Poet of Collision. I'll just read you a few lines. Hammett views politics as crime most cancerous and genteel, its crime buttressed by unspoken sanction, its crime facilitated by a callous legal system, its crime enforced by vicious cops in hobnailed boots. Hammett treats politics as crime in deadpan fashion. He assumes that the reader knows this. Politics is the manoeuvre, as public spectacle and reverential shuck. That means America was a land grab. That means all political discourse is disingenuous. That means his workman heroes refuse to soliloquize or indict. They know the game is rigged, and they're feeding off scraps of trickle-down graft. Hammett saw himself as complicit. The realization may have fueled his self-destructive path with alcohol and women. He was a Pinkerton. He signed on to work for an enforcement agency that squashed workers flat. He knew it was wrong. He knew he was wrong. He did the job on an ad hoc basis and couched his maneuverings within the maneuver in a personal moral code. The monstrous force of systemic corruption cast his code and his own job holder's life in extreme miniature and rendered everything about him small, except his guilt. And that is a really good, beautifully written summation of and critique of Hammett's work. The Continental Op does arrive in Poisonville, and he's not going to make the situation better. There's no chance of that. There's been a lot of romanticizing of the Pinkertons in fiction, when in reality a lot of them were just violent thugs. But the Continental Op will somehow maneuver through it, doing some bad things, some good things. It's completely unpredictable, but will somehow survive it. Not just survive physically, but just survive with somehow his conscience intact. Now let me get a little bit personal here. So ELLROY became very good friends with one of Hammett's biographers. That was Richard Lehman, the great Richard Lehman. And in the 1980s, Lehman revived Black Mask magazine. And some of ELLROY's first short stories appeared in Black Mask, the revived version. And they were later collected into numerous anthologies that ELLROY has published. The friendship, has survived several decades. And Lehman, who lives in South Carolina, runs a publishing business, was instrumental in the University of South Carolina acquiring Hammett's archive. And a few years ago, ELLROY was visiting the University of South Carolina to give a talk, and he showed Lehman a list of biographers that he considered might be worthy of writing his biography, and they were big names. And Lehman said, no. Pick somebody who's written about you, who knows about you critically, doesn't have to do it from scratch, admires your work and has written about it intelligently and academically. And sure enough, very shortly thereafter, I became ELLROY's biographer. And I got to interview Richard Lehman for the ELLROY biography. I got to thank him for inadvertently helping me land the gig. And I said, do you have any advice on, just writing a biography? Because it was a huge undertaking, it was a big challenge. And he said, no, I'm just glad it was you, which I thought was very flattering. And he said, well, you've got this marvelous access, you're close to ELLROY, but be your own man, stand your ground. And broadly speaking, I think I did. His experiences were very, very different, because his biography, Shadow Man, which was actually instrumental in cutting away some of the myths around Hammett's life. Lillian Hellman, Hammett's de facto widow, refused to cooperate in any way. And not only that, she told everybody she knew not to cooperate with Lehman. And Lehman said he was quite hamstrung by this. He could only talk to the people who knew Hammett, who were outside of Hellman's circle. But in a way, that was good for him because it gave him that independence as a biographer he thrived on. And there's the medical examiner in Elroy's novels, Nort Lehman. Elroy took his name, but that's very much Richard's style. He's concise, he's scientific, he's very much he's on top of the details and everything. So thanks to Richard, I got picked to be Elroy's biographer, and this Tuesday I am flying out to New York for the Edgar ceremony because Love Me, Fierce and Danger has been picked. It's what has been nominated and shortlisted for the Edgar Award for best biography, and I'm up against Max Allan Collins. Spillane biography. I'm up against two Poe biographers, all splendid writers. I mean, very distinguished company. So wish me luck, and when I'm back, I will have lots of stories to tell you. I will have a new book, which I'm going to be studying while I'm away, to cover on Elroy Reads, and I will see you in the next episode. I hope you've enjoyed this episode, and do go back and read the classics. Dashiell Hammett, Red Harvest. He didn't write that many novels. The Dane Curse, The Maltese Falcon, most famously. Elroy has said that Red Harvest is better than Maltese Falcon. The Thin Man, The Glass Key. Glass Key is a great novel. It's turned into a wonderful film as well. Do read them. If there's anything I like to do through this show, it's to inspire people to go back and read these novels more, especially if they've dropped off your radar a bit. Now, if you excuse me, I've got some more James Joyce to read. Okay, thanks very much. See you next time.